Jim Delany has been in charge of arguably the nation's most prestigious and powerful sports conference, the Big Ten, since 1989, and has certainly conjured up criticism and some praise along the way. We'd like to analyze his tenure, and of course, that ends after the 2020 sports calendar. Got Steve Dace on the line from Michigan Podcast. Steve, how you doing?
I'm good, Mark. Always good to talk to you, brother. How are you?
Absolutely. I'm doing just fine. Wanted to get your perspective. As I mentioned before we started to record, you were the first person that came to mind in terms of getting some insight into Jim Delany's tenure. Certainly, we could point to the positives. And first and foremost, I think that means money. It means power. The Big Ten has flourished regardless of the product on the field, whether it be football or basketball, and those, of course, the revenue sports. The product in terms of the dollar value of the conference has done nothing but escalate past just about everybody, excluding the SEC.
Yeah, I think you can make a really strong argument, Mark, that Jim Delany was the most influential figure in collegiate sports post-World War II era. Or at the very least in the television era, which, would probably go back to not when games started being on TV, but when the CFA won their Supreme Court antitrust Supreme Court decision against the NCAA. When was that? Early '80s. I mean,
Yep.
And I was just born on the tail end of this, but for our younger listeners, they may not realize there was a time where the NCAA would cap how many times you could be on TV. And so, for example, if you go online to like YouTube and you watch old games, the original broadcast from the 70s, for example, and, you'll see Keith Jackson, Chris Schenkel promoting games from, following Michigan, Ohio State, we've got Tulsa and Sam Houston State. You're like, what in the Sam Hill is that on national TV for? Okay, well, the reason why is because the NCAA mandated how many games you were permitted to be on TV. I can remember even as recently as 1988, listening to Michigan, Illinois on the radio play for the de facto Big Ten championship because the game wasn't on television. Okay, so that's really the television era, this idea of everything being on TV and everything else. And so certainly Jim Delany is one of the most influential figures of that era, maybe the most influential figure. That doesn't mean influential, doesn't mean, he had the Midas touch, doesn't mean he was right about everything. But really, every advent of innovation and what we know in college football either happened because of Jim Delany or occurred with his permission, depending on which way you look at it.
Yeah, so Jim Delany, in listening to him speak, most notably, sometimes his decisions weren't necessarily in step with his traditionalist approach, and I understand that. He certainly had to not just take his own personal value system and try to implement it on each and every occasion, but he certainly was pro-student portion of the student athlete more so than his contemporaries in other leagues, and tried to defend that, tried to keep some balance in check in place in regards to the student athlete approach to university life and athletics.
And that's part of, that's the Big Ten's mantra. The Big Ten was the last major conference to allow multiple teams to go to a bowl game. That didn't occur until, the first time a Big Ten team played in a bowl game, other than the Rose Bowl, was Michigan played Oklahoma in the Orange Bowl in 1976.
Yeah. Okay,
so, that's part of the culture of the Big Ten. And again, this, for our younger viewers, listeners, a lot of that comes from, a lot of these universities, you go back to like the Northwest Ordinance and they under President Thomas Jefferson and stuff like that. And a lot of these universities, Michigan was founded in 1817. So a lot of these universities were the first generation children of the Ivy League schools that came out of the East Coast. So that's where the notion of Michigan as the Harvard of the Midwest, for example, You've ever wondered what does it mean in the victors, champions of the West? You're in the Eastern time zone. How is that the champions of the West? Well, when they started playing football here, and when this university was established, and that's true for Ohio State, Illinois, and all those heritage teams in the league, this was the West. So I mean, we hadn't finished the Continental Railroad yet out to the West Coast, for goodness sakes.
That's right.
That was one of the reasons. That was one of the reasons why the USC Notre Dame rivalry was started, was to promote that. Okay, so it was a vastly different culture then. These are very proud academic institutions. It's why I can't remember the name of it now, but it's why the Big Ten, when it's added members, has sought groups that belong to that elite group of research schools. They searched. I think the one exception they made was for Nebraska. And they got Nebraska into that academic faction, part of them joining the Big Ten. So, this has never been a part of the country that has considered itself a factory for athletics primarily. And if you go back to the ancient history of the Big Ten, that was, when Michigan left the league for a while after basically starting it, that was its big concern. Is Fielding Yost kind of wanted a football factory. They took guys like Willie Heston, who might have been, there's some estimates he was like 25 years old when he played for Michigan. Okay. He was the first real college football superstar of all time in the early 20th century. And, back in those days, Fielding Yost was kind of known for what we would call today just pretty typical of what you expect big-time athletics to do, or in the SEC, what they call JV. But, in the Big Ten, it's always been a heavy emphasis on the academic side of things. And I think it served Jim Delany well, where I think, and, this happens, most people in leadership stay too long, Mark, whether it's sports, politics, etc. It's one of the great lines in the history of movies, which is, you either, die the hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And I think one of the things that Delany did was he probably stayed too long. And when you look at, what do I mean by that? The current era where more politicking is needed, more advocacy is needed, like the playoff era in the last few years, really hesitant to do that. And I think it hurt schools in the league, particularly the champion, the last few years. And you go back to even this year when, he was like, no, I mean, the system's working great. When the champion was left out again. And it was almost as if guys in the Big Ten network said, screw this, man, we're going to do this ourselves. And guys like Jerry DiNardo and others went out there on their own, basically, on the network and said, no, this isn't working. And this needs some reform. And then, a couple weeks later, Delany comes out and says, oh, yeah, this isn't working that well, And so I think that's just kind of a man at a time from a different era where you kind of did things behind the scenes. Like we wake up one day and Penn State's in the Big Ten with no warning, That's not the era in which we live. And it's going to take somebody that's going to be a little bit less Godfather and a little bit more glad-hander and media savvy. I think the Big Ten's going to need that in its next commissioner.
Got Steve Deace on the line from Michigan Podcast. We encourage you to jump on your favorite audio platform or right here on YouTube and check out Steve's take on Michigan football, basketball, and the rest of the Big Ten in the nation. And we're discussing Jim Delany's decision and announcement to step down as Big Ten commissioner following the 2020 sports calendar. He's been the commissioner since 1989. When you mention Penn State, of course, there's going to be a number of people, especially considering my demographic. I think my number one demographic is males 25 to 34 here, Steve, that may not even be aware that Penn State's a recent entry into the Big Ten. So that was in 1992-93 that Penn State joined the Big Ten, which was certainly a great get for the conference for the number one sport, football, especially since the league seemed to be falling behind the SEC at the time. That was kind of the first wave of falling behind the SEC, and Penn State, many thought, would dominate the Big Ten. That didn't happen. It was certainly competitive and has been for the most part during these 26 to 27 seasons. So that was, I don't think there's any question, that was, and I'm thinking from a football first standpoint because that's my show, that's my topic. The Nebraska entry into the Big Ten certainly made sense. I talked about it at the time. I was all for it. Again, from a football perspective, I know from a monetary perspective, it wasn't a huge get, but it's a football brand since the 50s and 60s. Now we go to the more recent Rutgers and Maryland. Your thoughts at the time in bringing in those two, and your thoughts in looking over the last 4 to 5 football seasons.
Well, when we went through the last round of expansion in the Big Ten, the local sports show I had at the time, I guaranteed. In fact, I think I told our audience that I thought it was as sure a thing as gravity, I think was the line I used at the time, that Missouri and Maryland will be in the Big Ten. And the reason I said those two schools was there's really one major Midwestern market that the Big Ten, if you're building a network, hasn't really tapped into, and that would be that Kansas City, St. Louis, what do they call it, the I-70 corridor.
Yep.
And then the other, they need something to, if they weren't going to go to the South, you remember there was a lot of talk about, Georgia Tech, because they're one of those AAU academic schools, trying to find some kind of Southern harbor for the league. And so if they thought that was outside of their natural footprint, well, then you would go east. And really the only place on the East Coast right now that is experiencing demographic growth is the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia, that area there. And so that's why Maryland would work. And that methodology is actually what Delany went with. He just went with Nebraska to that Kansas City, St. Louis area instead of Missouri. And with Nebraska, you're getting, of course, with Nebraska, Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State, those are 4 of the 7 winningest programs in the history of the sport. And the problem has been, though, that Nebraska coming into our league has no natural recruiting footprint. The coach, Bill Callahan, really wrecked the legendary walk-on program they had there when he took over. Bo Pelini did a good job, even though he was an Ohio guy. He did a really good job recruiting Texas and that Southlands region for Nebraska in the Big 12. But now that region, they're not really a part of that in the Big 10. They're kind of too far north now to recruit that area. They're kind of too far west to go into Chicago, Minneapolis, and some of those places. And so now the hope is with Scott Frost, he's enough of a national brand, and then you get a couple of players from here and a couple of players from there, and put together a team worthy of overlooking the fact that they were going to be the weakest academic university in our conference, bringing them in. And you did it and they weren't going to add anything really in any sport you care about. So you did this for football prestige. And so far it hasn't worked out. I think Nebraska's not had a season, Mark, without losing at least 4 games since the year that they fired Frank Solich when he lost 3. I think they've lost at least 4 games every year since then, since 2003. Maryland, I think, has been a huge boost for the league, made a ton of sense from a revenue standpoint, a population growth standpoint. And if you look at how well, Big Ten teams have always prioritized Maryland in that New Jersey area for recruiting. But especially speaking for me as a Michigan fan, I mean, that has almost been as big of a boom to us as we've got almost as many of our elite players out of there as we have from our own backyard. You know the old history of Michigan and Ohio State. I mean, Michigan really stayed competitive in that rivalry for many, many years and had an edge during the Carr era because of its ability to pull the Charles Woodsons and Marcus Rays and Sean Crables and, Prescott Burgesses out of the state of Ohio. And it's not pulling those kind of kids out of Ohio anymore. Since Cooper left, Ohio State's done a great job of really putting that state on lockdown. And so Harbaugh needed to find another main recruiting port outside of the state to feed a pipeline there. And it's really been that DMV, New Jersey area. And I think adding Maryland and even Rutgers has been a huge boon to helping programs like Michigan do that.
So you're providing a perspective there that many would not have because they would just simply look at wins and losses. And Rutgers has obviously become a disaster on the field.
I think everybody has Rutgers wrong. Rutgers is the perfect addition. Here's why. Because you're getting a mass of eyeballs. And I've had to travel to New York for my day job numerous times. And, yeah, okay. Rutgers might be the 10th or 11th most visible sports entity there. Here's the thing. There's probably more Michigan fans in New York City than there are Rutgers fans.
Sure.
I mean, go back to the Big Ten tournament last year. Go to the last couple of games where Michigan took on Michigan State and Purdue. Those are like games at Chrysler Arena, for goodness sakes. Okay. And there's a huge, several Big Ten teams, Iowa, Wisconsin, Ohio State, have pretty large alumni presences out there. Okay. So Rutgers, in many respects, it's not their on-field or on-court lack of success that's the problem. In many respects, they're perfect because they suck at almost everything. And they give you access to the #1 media market on planet Earth. Okay. If it weren't for all the the scandals with the administration and everything else, I'd actually say that's a pretty good bargain you got there. You got access to all those eyeballs and another massive recruiting base, and you brought in a program that's in no danger of toppling your brands that you want to create a recruiting pipeline for. So Rutgers is a pretty good patsy, if you ask me.
Got Steve Dace on the line from Michigan Podcast, responding to the announcement today from Jim Delany that he's stepping down after 2020. So along with those TV markets and why they're so important is, of course, because of the advent of a sports league television network, and the very first was the Big Ten Network. The SEC, it could be argued, has become a bit of a standard there because of the affiliation with ESPN and all the bells and whistles and the marketing that goes with that, opening in more homes than any network in the history of television. But the Big Ten has been certainly a huge success, and not speaking to the quality of the programming or the direction of the programming, the approach to the content that's placed on the air, but in regards to just bringing in dollars, it's been a massive success.
It's not arguable. I mean, we're in an environment right now where Northwestern pulls in more broadcast revenue than USC does, than Notre Dame does, than Texas does, than virtually everybody not in the Big Ten does. So the numbers speak for themselves, man.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. They speak for themselves. Now, if you watch the SEC network and the Big Ten network, clearly there's some production value that the Big Ten network could improve upon. They've gotten better in their studio talent. I don't know why for several years we'd have guys that never even played the Big Ten. I think it's because, Fox owned 49% of the network and figured that this was a good place to have, try out their talent, but that's gotten a little bit better. I think the major difference between the two leagues is, in the SEC, their homerism is different than we're used to up here. And I watch a lot of SEC athletics because I like to watch the best, and they're among the best. And pretty much everything that matters. You can't deny that. God bless Howard Griffith and Jerry DiNardo. I watch every one of those tour stops they do, and I've done it every year during camp tour. And in the last couple of years, I think DiNardo has felt freer to be more opinionated. But for the most part, they are sports information director tours. Okay, and so you kind of almost have to translate what they're saying. Like when DiNardo says, "Well, this offensive line's really young." Translation, they can't block their way out of a paper bag. Okay, on the SEC network, their guys will say their offensive line's not any good. so I think that probably one of my best friends, a guy named John Miller, and he was with the Big Ten Network when it launched, and they tried putting him with Charles Bentley, the old Ohio State All-American, to do like their own opinionated show, and let's just say Delany used to monitor the show and was not happy with actually giving opinions. Okay, so maybe that's something else where the entertainment factor of the network can be improved in the future. What do they do during the off season? Like, I've always thought it would be so cool if they went into the archives. Like, let's say this off season, meaning after, basketball and the spring sports season is done. And you have that period there from, unless the Big Ten team's in the college softball or baseball World Series, you basically have a period of time from the, end the middle of May until, or the end of May until the start of August, where, there's not much happening. What if they went into the archives and they did like they pretended like it was 1989, and each week the games from that year were like on the air, and they like broke them down and stuff like that. I'd watch that stuff for fun. What do you want? I know you would watch it, right?
Oh yeah, I'd be there.
And there's all kinds of stuff with the history and the tradition of the league that the Big Ten Network just doesn't do a sufficient enough job for, if you ask me.
Yeah, probably the best documentary that comes to mind for me is one that I believe we've alluded to in the past, and that's the Michigan-Ohio State tie in 1973.
Yeah, they did a great job with that.
They really did a great job with that, and it doesn't cast the league in the best light, but I think that's been so far removed, it being 45 to 46 years ago, that they probably felt comfortable portraying that story.
Mm-hmm.
More so than they would had it happen in 1995.
And I think that is, again, that's kind of more of an old school mentality. And that's kind of the era that Delany was from. But sooner or later, now that the ACC network's going to launch this year, sooner or later, the Pac-12 has some incredible markets out there. I mean, they're being heavily mismanaged. Sooner or later, that's going to figure out. And what will happen is there'll be more competition for distributorship on these platforms. And, they're going to have to come up with a reason to watch the network other than live events. Because right now, there's not much of a reason to other than live events.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the Big Ten basketball has been thriving for the most part in the last 25 years. I know there was a down spell for a few years, but it looks to be arguably the best in the league again this year.